Hey guys, how we doing today? We got some thunderstorms going on here, so it's a little darker than normal. There's a sick disease spreading through the land. It's so ugly, but somewhat transparent. Another black police shooting happened. Again, the cops weren't indicted. One of the things that I think is most telling about all of this is if this was all just sheer accidents and mistakes being made, where's the accidental shooting of whites by the cops? You know, that's the question I think that needs to be asked. How many accidental sleeping white couples get gunned down and assassinated? And I'm by no means anti-police. I don't think they're the problem. I think there's engines at work that have them just as scared, just as misinformed. And with this election cycle culminating, I think there's absolutely powers at work to provoke and to divide and to keep the two sides apart. It's an old story. I'm getting tired of saying it, but I've seen the effects of this stuff and how they're making people choose between minorities, ethnicities, or the police. And with the election looming, they've got to keep that polarity as powerful and as strong as possible. And if this was all just random mistakes being made, there should be 70% more accidentally shot white people in their homes, in their sleeps, on being arrested on the side of the highway, getting shot and killed by the police. But that's not what's happening. It's obviously something that's pretty much targeting one community only. And it's why jazz music exists. I have a sneaking suspicion, I don't have proof of this, but I feel like there's an intelligent side that's fomenting fear in the police departments. And so when they go into homes, even the wrong addresses, they're so on edge, they're so scared by what they've been told about who they're going to get, what they're doing. And I'm not sure that makes sense, but I don't know what else to say, because how do you kill a sleeping couple? How do you try to pretend like we didn't have an opportunity to question them? You are armed, they're sleeping. You should be able to detain them without killing them. And then I also think that there was a few cops shot in retaliation, I guess, last night. And I would guess those same powers that are provoking the one side probably also paid for the cops to get shot. Not murdered, just shot. To make that divide crystal clear to the average American. And maybe that's too big a conspiracy for some people, but the alternative to me is so much uglier. The alternative of what, if it's not being designed by power structures to manipulate, then the truth of it is that it's just pure racism, hate, and fear. And I don't think people are that innately evil. I don't think there's that much. Do I think there's racist cops? Yeah. Do I think that they run the police departments? No. I don't. I don't think there's that many of them. And I think that what we're experiencing here is... I'm trying to find a place where I get good light here. I apologize. I think what we're experiencing here is powers that be who want to keep the streets lit on fire, to maintain certain economic systems in place, funding for certain departments, the arming of the police departments. There's people that make money off this chaos. And if that means they gotta give some wrong intelligence somehow to some police receiving a warrant, delivering a warrant, and make those cops so on edge that they're a little trigger happy, if that means that they got to put one bad seed in there to provoke and incite shootings, and the other cops are just kind of forced to be part of the blue wall, if this was all just random coincidence and accidents, there should be a lot more dead, innocent white people. But it's hard to even think of the last time there was a well-publicized police shooting of a white male, white couple, white whatever, that turned out to be unprovoked, accidental, and essentially an assassination. I've kind of decided, and I've talked with enough people, that those of you who don't like my social content, see ya. I gotta speak what my heart tells me to say. I'm gonna speak from my soul. And jazz and social issues are so interwoven that I can't extricate them. And when you see the beginnings of a civil war in this country, and make no mistake about it, when cops are shooting down sleeping couples, and then there's retribution with cops being shot in the streets, it's designed to create such a conflict that someone's going to get rich off of. The status quo will remain. And I'm sickened by all of it. I'm sickened by all of it. There's no way police with their modern intelligence and tracking of cell phones and computers in the cars can show up at the wrong address and kill a couple sleeping in the middle of the night. It can't happen. Especially not in a climate where it's going to provoke and incite more tyranny and chaos. Unless there's somebody that's doing it to do that very thing. That's the only way it makes sense. There's no way this many black people can innocently get shot in an election cycle by sheer coincidence. It's insane to think that's possible. I don't care how conservative you are. If you think that there's just many innocent black people getting shot while they're trying to be detained, it's designed to create racial conflict and tension, and someone wants to sell guns to both sides. And it's so ridiculous and sensational that if it was a movie, I wouldn't believe it. I just wouldn't buy it. I'm like, this is bullshit. And that's how I feel about a lot of the headlines I'm seeing. And I can't even really follow the news. You know, I hear about it by second and third string sources. You know, watching athletes talk about it. And I don't really watch TV or sports. I kind of follow sports online a little bit to see the scores and what's happening. But it's so insane. It's so insane. And as a neutral observer, which I think I am, I'm a Canadian citizen. I'm not an American. I'm not voting in this whole thing. I don't claim to be Democratic or Republican. I'm definitely left of center in my belief systems, and I think that's how you build a stable society. But there's a wealthy right that the last thing they want is for all of us to agree that, yeah, some more socialism would be a good thing to create a stabler society. They've done a lot of crime to create that wealth, and they're not about to just hand it back. And I think they'll agitate, they'll foment, they will arm to the teeth all sides of this conflict. And they will assassinate, hire militants, subvert movements. They look forward to protests so they can send their paid dissenters in there to subvert these movements and to create. You should see some of the advertisements in this country, how they're making the liberals look like they're the supporters of complete anarchy, tyranny, and watching the cities burn. And that's what you're voting for. And there's so many red state conservative American citizens who don't live in the city and don't know any better, aside from what they see on TV. And so they're scared away from voting in their own interests because the TV is telling them that if I vote for that, they're going to create a place where everything's crazy, chaos, war. Shame. And my belief system tells me that if you kill for greed, there's no forgiveness in this cosmos for you. You will receive a punishment somehow in this life or the next. If you kill for need, that's a different judgment. And these rich people who are fomenting terror and tyranny and chaos and civil strife, you will get yours eventually. The little fish will eat down the big fish eventually, as Bob Marley once said. And again, you people who don't want to hear it, go watch something else. Tune into something else. You know, I'm not claiming to be an expert. I'm just claiming to tell you how my heart feels. And if this was all just random, there should be a lot of dead white civilians accidentally being killed by the police. And if that was the case, and here's the thing, there could be white people still getting shot mistakenly by the police, but it's receiving no coverage because it doesn't fit the current agenda. That's the thing. They pick and select the news stories that are so polarizing, and it delivers what they're looking for. An ugly, ugly divide. Shame on us. How can we not know better? How can we still be here in 2020? The power of the television. I'm partway through pulling out my 1961 records. I'll probably start that series this weekend. Today we're going to do 2 more albums, a 2x2 session. We're starting here with one of my favorite records, and has been for a long time. One of my first original prestige I ever got is this wonderful Red Garland record, Red Garland's Piano. It's got that lovely red tint to it. That's too bright. And it's got Art Taylor and Paul Chambers, a great trio. It's just beautiful Red Garland, and I'm a huge fan of his playing. He's not trying to reinvent the wheel. He's just a melodic, spatially driven player it fits my template frequently. Please Send Me Someone to Love, Almost Like Being in Love is fantastic. I Can't Give You Anything but Love, If I Were a Bell. All the tracks on this are just beautiful. There's a few up-tempo, a few mid-tempo, and a few ballads. And it's getting to be a tougher thing to come by, these old Red Garland records. 15 years ago, you'd find Red Garland records in record stores for a decent price. You wouldn't have to go bankrupt buying them. You know, you could find this for $7, $10, $15 up until about probably 2005 or so. And then the roof started coming off the collector's market in jazz. Vinyl started to come back, and jazz has always been one of the most collectible departments in vinyl, in part because jazz records sold so less than rock and pop records. You know, as collectible as Beatle records are, they sold millions of copies of Beatle records. You know, and so the rarity of those records, aside from the Butcher album and maybe the Christmas fan club record, the Beatles records aren't rare. They're out there, you know, and that's what keeps them from being the prices of a Hank Mobley. It's the rarity and the limited availability of a lot of these jazz records that's driven a lot of jazz records to the top of the collecting jazz market. They're just hard to find. The one good thing is, as little as they sold, they weren't beat up like R&B records were, or even rock records. A lot of rock records were partied with, and people danced and they fell on the floor, drinks got spilled on them. Funk and soul records, the same thing happens to. But the jazz records, even though a lot fewer of them sold, I feel like a lot more of them have survived. You know, probably half of these that got printed survived. Whereas rock and soul records, it's probably 10% of those survive in decent condition, but that's still way more than the percentages of the jazz records that sold 5,000 copies initially. You know, 60% of 5,000 still is only 3,000. 10% of a million, it's 100,000 copies still out there available to be found. It's something I wonder about at times. It's like when Hurricane Katrina went through New Orleans, how many great jazz records were lost? How many people had their records in their basement? A lot of first floors even got flooded. I bet you we lost some great jazz records with some of the natural disasters that have happened along the Atlantic coast and along the Gulf Coast, especially down in New Orleans way. It's hard to think about that at times, but man, I bet you we've lost some great stuff. And people also forget that in World War II, there was a shellac drive, and so people were donating their vinyl back to be melted down for the war cause. And so some of those really rare 78s from that era, how many of those great records were melted down? The Robert Johnson, which probably never had more than a few thousand copies made, how many of them got melted down to make it so there's only a few copies around nowadays, but they had to carefully try to clean and put on an LP. It's sad. But again, a lot of jazz records have survived the test of time, just again because of their they survived. The people who collected them were of a different ilk, and it wasn't a house party when they played their Red Garland. It was something the guy had with his morning coffee and toast. And thankfully, a lot of these records have survived, and they ended up being put into stores and online when people pass away. That's how most jazz records become available, from my experience, from people I've talked to in record stores. A lot of them come from people in their late years, either getting rid of them or someone passing, and no one knows what to do with them. Beautiful stuff, though. Great album cover. It's Prestige number 7086, and there's probably few records in my collection that I've heard as much as this. I've been listening to this Red Garland record for a long time, and I guess that's one of the first old Prestiges I found, and I've always loved the colors of it, just the mood of the pieces. It's just a wonderful, very sustainable sound for me that I'm never really tired of. And if you take anything from Red Garland in the 7000 series, it's going to be in this vein. A lot of it's going to be trios. A lot of it's with Paul Chambers and Art Taylor. It's fantastic. It really is. It's not trying to be super innovative. It's just playing the blues and the American songbook with feeling, with some sadness, with some sorrow, with some joy, with some excitement, with some passion. It's wonderful renditions of songs that if you know the lyrics, like I said in the last episode, you'll even enjoy more hearing how Garland phrases those words with the piano. It's pretty awesome hearing him speak through that keyboard at times. Like I said, it's truly one of my favorite albums of all time. In terms of its listenability, I come back to it all the time. Now, a slightly different vein, but also a wonderful, enjoyable listen. It's the great Dexter Gordon. And I came to Dexter a little bit later than guys like Red Garland. And again, that's part of the nature of marketing in the jazz world, is that Garland's associated and affiliated with Miles Davis. And so you fairly quickly discover Red Garland and Philly Joe Jones and John Coltrane and Paul Chambers, and it all interweaves. The artists who are outside of that Miles Coltrane bubble, it takes the average jazz consumer longer to start discovering those artists. And I remember reading about Dexter Gordon pretty early on as being one of the greats, but a lot of his recordings come before the war, late in the 40s, after the war. A lot of it's pre-LP era. Then he goes to jail for an extended period of time, and he comes back in '61, and he starts recording for Blue Note, and he makes probably 7 or 8 records that are all outstanding. And when you dig into Blue Note, Dexter becomes one of the luminaries there that you really learn to cherish, especially as your maturity increases as a jazz listener. When you're young and full of vivacity, Coltrane seems to fit the bill. Ornette Coleman's challenging. Pharoah Saunders is indulgent. As you mature a little bit, you discover Rollins, and maybe you like his center even a little bit more. But I think as you mature more and more, the sounds of Ben Webster, Coleman Hawkins, echoing through the horn of Dexter Gordon becomes a wonderful salve. And I've learned to cherish the Dexter Gordon Blue Note stuff. Sadly, a lot of his earlier stuff isn't well recorded. A lot of his stuff like Wardell Gray is like live stuff recorded on some guy's tape recorder when they were battling out in Central Avenue in Los Angeles. Long, tall Dexter was a giant of a man, 6'6" or something like that. So he towered over most of his contemporaries, except for maybe Paul Chambers, who was also a big guy. But he's got that real warm, centered tone. And Coltrane is influenced by Dexter Gordon. You know, the link is very strong. He influences pretty much all that next generation of horn players. Dexter is a huge factor in all their playing, how they sound. He's there at the beginnings of bebop. You know, he plays on some important West Coast early bebop stuff. Parker goes out to Central Avenue, and Wardell and Dexter are doing fantastic things. Teddy Edwards is a part of that scene. There was some fun stuff happening in LA in the late 40s. And of course, New York's the epicenter, but LA really had an interesting scene going on. And of course, the junk takes over Dexter Gordon's life for a stretch of time, and he spends too much time in jail, sadly. But I really highly recommend all of Dexter Gordon's Blue Note recordings. There's 2 records he does in '55 before his long jail time. There's a Bethlehem session that's really outstanding, and one on Dutone, a small West Coast label that's absolutely beautiful. Those are great records, but his Blue Note stuff is next level. And he has great sidemen. Sonny Clark's on this, Butch Warren, Billy Higgins. It's pretty much a standard of Dexter's Blue Note stuff is great sidemen. He does go to Paris about '64, I think it is, and he records with some European sidemen, as well as a few other Americans who are over there. And he stays in Europe for a long time, in Denmark and in Paris, Copenhagen and Denmark. And his being over there diminished his luminosity in the eyes of the American jazz fan. Any guy that was a figure in American jazz that spends long times in Europe really slips into obscurity here. And that's one of the sad counterbalances to their going to Europe, is the American audience loses touch, loses connection. Their recordings over there don't get imported nearly the same way or distributed the same way. Guys like Don Byas, who were there for 3 decades, became completely forgotten. And luckily, Dexter came back at a time when there was kind of a resurgence in acoustic jazz in the late 70s, and people were excited when Dexter came back. Even though he was kind of obscure and unfollowed there for a decade, his return was a big deal. And he tore up the club scene in the 80s for a good stretch. He's one of the true great players of this music. One of the progenitors that was there from the bridge of the swing era through bebop into hard bop into postmodern. He kind of follows that entire trajectory without ever letting any of it change who he is. He stays very much true to Dexter Gordon. And when the avant-garde's kind of taken over in 64, 65, Dexter doesn't feel any kind of obligation to start honking his horn and squawking and bleeding out. He still plays from a melodic place. He's still telling you a story. If it was good enough for Coleman Hawkins, if it was good enough for Ben Webster, if it was good enough for Illinois Jacquet, it's good enough for Dexter Gordon. And he's firmly in that lineage. And Rollins and Coltrane both openly admitted they owed Dexter Gordon a debt. He was a big influence on all of those guys. And so if you're a young collector looking for a guy that's got a wonderful melodic sensibility, knows how to tell a story and put you on your knee and help you experience the music and understand where it's coming from, Dexter Gordon's Blue Notes are a great place to jump in. And the nice thing about the Dexter Gordon Blue Notes is that they've all been kind of reissued numerous times, so you're not out there fighting and scrapping over a few original copies for thousands of dollars. You can get decent reissues for $20-$30, and they're all worth having. All of them are great. And no one plays a ballad like Dexter Gordon. Truly no one. I Guess I'll Hang My Tears Out to Dry is one of the most beautiful pieces that I've ever heard. And again, you should probably hear the song with the words to really be able to appreciate the phrasing and cadence of what Dexter's telling you. He's emulating that experience and telling you that same tale of woe, but because the lyric content is vague, being a horn emoting, it's putting his own experience into that melody. That's the magic of jazz. The magic of jazz isn't reinventing mathematics. It's taking somebody else's melody and stripping it of its words and placing your experience on top of it through that melody. That's a pretty brilliant form of art. It's essentially a remix. And it's an important thing to kind of understand as well, is that a lot of jazz music, going back to the swing era, was remixing popular tunes that weren't dancey at all and making them danceable. So you have some great black swing band taking songs from Broadway and putting a pulsing groove behind them and making it so people could dance to it, but they still knew the melody, so they felt comfortable with the song. And that's no different than some club DJ today taking some Adele track that's not danceable and putting a dubstep groove or a hip-hop beat or a down-tempo groove behind an Adele song to make it so you can move to it. It's the same concept. People will know the Adele until they'll feel comfortable with the content. and even sing along with it. But instead of it being a minimalist groove that doesn't have a pulse, they add that house beat, boom, boom, and all of a sudden people can get their groove on. And jazz was that same thing. It was taking songs that weren't danceable but were well known and making them danceable, remixing them. And some groups would have the singer there doing the vocal, but in a lot of cases the jazz players didn't use singers. That allows them to express their situation on top of that content and give it a whole new meaning. That's pretty outstanding stuff. That's a pretty cool art form that allows you to borrow the skeleton of somebody else's piece but reinvent it and make it yours. And all the remixing projects of today all take a back seat to what jazz music does, because it doesn't just make it danceable, it reinvents it emotionally. See what I'm saying? A lot of remixes today will change the beat to make it danceable. That's understandable. But these guys could take a song that was fluffy in content, saccharine, and of little depth, but because they stripped the vocal away and just used the melody, we can hum along to the song because we know it. But if we have empathy, we can hear a whole deeper side of the music as this person expresses their elements to us. That's pretty fantastic stuff. So Dexter Gordon, all his Blue Note stuff is so worthy of being collected, and you can get it for good prices. And it's honestly, if you're 18 to 25 years old and you're looking for a great place to start with jazz, Dexter Gordon, Dexter Gordon, all those early ones, the one with the phone booth, they're all great records that will give you a great central location to start your metropolis of jazz. And you'll see how some avenues go this way and some alleys go that way and some buildings go up and some things sink down, but for the most part this is the center of the jazz universe. Dexter Gordon's linked to all the greats before him, and he's influenced all the greats after him. So he's a great center to start. And it'll give you a much broader stroke of the jazz kingdom than the Miles Davis universe. And Miles Davis shares some of that same lineage with Dexter Gordon, but too many people get stuck in that universe alone. And Dexter's influence goes back earlier than Miles, and of course it doesn't continue later Miles, which I don't care for nearly as much. Both great records. The Red Garland's outstanding. Like I said, I've listened to it for the last half of my life religiously. It never gets too far from my turntable. Both these records are favorites of mine. Very accessible, very fun, very enjoyable LPs. And as far as the politics goes, shame on them. Shame on them. But if you're a fan of history, you see this is what happens towards the end of the empirical cycle. They turn the people against themselves. The serpent consumes its own tail. And there's no more enemy for them to wipe out to keep us afraid of. So now we have to be afraid of each other. Now we have to be militarized against each other. And if I don't have an enemy anymore, they'll make you my enemy. And race is such an easy tissue to rip the stitches out of and reinflate. Religion's an easy wound to open. And at the underlying bottom of all of this is the greed of those few who have power and wealth who don't want to see it diminished. And you know how I know that? Because every time in history, that's what it's been. There's no exception. There's no, oh, but there was this. No, it's always been the rich manipulating poor against the poor to keep control of the wealth and to prevent the poor from uniting against the 1%. I guarantee it. And the shame and ridicule we will live in a millennium from now when they look back on us, I'm embarrassed to be a part of it. I'm ashamed to live in a world and a society that's this vulnerable, this gullible, this divided, the people in the Roman Empire, in the Mongol Empire, in the Egyptian Empire, they had the excuse of not knowing the planet. We don't have that excuse. We have exposure to satellites and the genealogy that illustrates to us that we should be one humanity and that race and religion are all insignificant and don't define us. And nation is such a small, antiquated, outmoded piece of governance. For us to be so religious about the nation that we're born into is blind man's cane. Tap your way through that darkness, but you're not going to find your way out. Because the enemy is not the poor. The enemy is not the middle class. The enemy is not somebody who prays differently, or looks different, or eats different food. The enemy has always been, and always will be, those in power with the wealth who do not want to relinquish it. And it's not like it's their inheritance and they've earned it. They've simply killed the best. That's how wealth is built. You were the best at killing in that moment in time, and so you've committed the greatest crimes to accrue the greatest amount of gold chips. And you got to scramble and do a lot to keep and maintain that stack. And if you want to keep growing that pile of chips, you got to keep finding people to turn against each other. It's such a mess. It's such a mess. The guy in power says he's not going to relinquish the results of the election. He's not going to turn over. It's textbook. It's textbook. It absolutely is. This is what happens. This is what happens when you let fear govern your decision making. When you let small-minded ignorance be the temple you pray in. We've demonized education. We've demonized, and that's part of the thing, is that the camps are so divided, red and blue, that all the college towns are on one camp. And if you're on the other camp, you got to turn your nose up and look down on education as part of the problem. That should open your eyes a little bit. People with education broaden their spectrum of understanding and start to have empathy for other groups of poor, recognizing that they are also victims. And so they start to have empathy for those other groups, and they assimilate. And they can't have all of us joining that empathy, because that unity would be devastating to their control. So they make it look like those groups that they're siding with anarchists. They're siding with terrorists. They're siding with people who want to keep our streets on fire. And when great injustice happens and people protest, they subvert those protests to make it look like to the people from the country that, look at all those urban people. They would rather burn our nation to the ground than be an American. Man, you haven't read your history much, have you? My name's Dan. I'm a jazz shepherd. I plan on this weekend starting 1961 Part 1. It's a great year. Some fantastic artists show up on the scene in 1961, and the changes of the late 50s are now all what's happened in the 50s is already kind of outmoded. And hard bop, as we know, it's going to kind of fade away. Bebop's kind of slipped into obscurity. Elements of avant-garde and composition start to take over. A new young generation of players comes up that had less struggle. They still have plenty of struggle, but there's more desire to detach from what the first couple generations of jazz did. There's a militancy in the streets as social movements and political movements are creating a great new resistance against what's happening. Spiritual jazz starts to become another subgenre of the music. So we start to see soul jazz arrive on the scene. Really what happens in 55, 56, 57, but 61, 62, it's crazy how different the landscape is already. It really is. And a lot of the great jazz labels of the late 50s are gone. Savoy, Bethlehem, Emersy, Riverside's got 1 more or 2 years left, and they're gone. Blue Note's got 5 years left, and they're going to be gone. Impulse arrives on the scene. Verve has created this brand new sound. Labels like Candid are putting out controversial, edgy stuff. And then ESP and other smaller labels are going to start doing even more provocative music. And European labels are going to start showing up, putting out very provocative music. There's enough Americans in Europe that need to be recorded. Labels are starting to be born in Germany and Denmark and England and France, putting out this music, and a whole new chapter of jazz is birthed over there. One I'm not super fluent in. I know about a lot of it. I've heard some of it. I don't own much of it. But it's definitely a part of this history. So it's, as we jump into the 60s, the changes are becoming more and more rapid all the time. So stay tuned. I appreciate you for supporting the channel. Please check out my Patreon page and pledge your support if you enjoy the content. And there's also great Jazz Shepherd merchandise now available at my Teespring site. There's going to be links to both of those below. Grab a t-shirt, grab a hoodie. It's great marketing for me, and I appreciate the support. Y'all be safe. Have a good day. Peace.